So, quick introduction, I'm Chris Chabot. I work in the Google Plus developer relations team. I've been doing social stuff at Google for the last 3.5 years or so, I think. So nowadays, it's all about Google Plus at Google, right? And when we launched Google Plus, this was the graphic that we used to launch it. And we had a big change in the way that you're navigating through Google. There's now plus U in the top left corner. It's the most important thing. It's the first menu element. At least in the English language, the top left is the most important. I guess here would be the top right, right? Yeah? I guess so. So the important implicit message here is that we're putting you at the very center of Google. This is now the most important thing in Google general. And that means quite a bit. If you think about, so what does it mean? Google used to be very good at a whole bunch of things. It's good at search. It's arguably, I think, the best search engine on the web. I use it every day. I'm a big fan of Android as well. Chrome is pretty cool. YouTube is definitely the video destination site to go. And we got all these other cool products. There's Maps, there's Blogger, there's etc. Too many to count, right? But they were good at certain things, but they weren't necessarily good at understanding the relationships between people. And that's one of the big changes on the web right now, that we've moved from a document-centric web, where everything was about static information, to a web where relationships are becoming increasingly important in how we consume information on the web. And it makes sense if you think about it, because when you want to buy a new camera, for instance, you probably ask your friends what camera they like. You don't necessarily trust a stranger on the corner of a street who's shouting at you with some recommendation. So social means there's trust relationships, there's affinity, there's emotions. About 50% of our brain is dedicated to understanding social complex relationships. So people matter. And we're starting to enter an era where people are becoming a part of the web as well. It's becoming part of how you experience it. So in my session today, I'm going to do a quick introduction on what have we built and what have we launched so far, to give you a bit of a feeling of what's out there and what our thinking behind it is. Then I'll tell you a little story about why are we building the platform in the way that we are. If you've taken a small peek at our APIs, you're probably wondering like, well, okay, it's a relatively small set. I don't have all the functionality I would like to have just yet. Why is that? So I felt it was important to spend 5 or 10 minutes just going through behind our strategic thinking behind it. And finally, I'd like to walk you through basic, how do you use the API and how do you interact with the platform. Later in the day, we're also going to have a +1/publisher session. It's actually Ade, who's sitting in the front row, who'll be doing the session right after me. So he will talk about the plus pages, the +1 button, the brand badge, and all those technologies. And after him, we'll have Jonathan talking about how to build a Hangouts app. So between those 3 sessions, we'll cover all the technologies that are available on the Google Plus platform. So to start off, I'd like to, well, probably when most of you are thinking about Google Plus, you're thinking about this page, right? Which partially is true. And I say partially because, of course, Google Plus is about making everything at Google better by understanding people. It's about making Android better. It's about making search better with the social recommendations. It's about making shopping experiences and news and maps and everything better. But still, when you're thinking about building Google Plus applications, this is probably the visual you get in your mind. And it is an important one because this is your social inbox. This is where you interact with people. This is where you see how people are represented. And the interesting thing for me has always been that when you look at social networks, they always have a certain feeling to it. You must have noticed that on Twitter, you probably send out different messages than you would on Facebook. And on Facebook, you write different things than you would on LinkedIn. And a large part of that is, well, as they say in Germany, the Fingerspitzengefühl. It's like the DNA of a social network that lends itself to a certain type of use case. Like in Twitter, of course, the main characteristic that everybody would describe is that it's limited to 140 characters. You can't really reply and have long threads there, so it lends to a certain type of conversation, a type of microblogging, right? And for every social network, there's probably different types of conversations that people react to each other, how long the pieces are that you write. There is something in there that creates the type of environment that it is and the type of behavior that people are showing there. And the thing that I think is so interesting with Google Plus is that it's really become a conversation network. And that's pretty unique. It's a place where real people go with real emotions to have real conversations with each other. And that's different from a lot of other social networks. In fact, this is the first social network where I've seen these kind of lengthy, big conversations happening. And a couple of things that go into it that are probably nice to keep in mind when you're thinking about how would I build an application that uses the Google Plus social graph activities and all that jazz is, well, one of the qualities that's definitely relatively unique to it, there's others, but still, is that it's incredibly real time. I know that I've got a few followers on Google Plus, but when I post something, within seconds, there's replies there. I'm engaged with a conversation with people right there on the spot. And I see +1s happening, and I respond to those, and other people respond, and it's a live conversation. It's like you're standing around the water cooler and you're talking with people. That's a pretty unique experience, right? And because it's such a unique human experience, we're seeing all these unique social stories happening as well. A friend of mine lost his camera a little while ago, so he posted about that on Google+. And all his photography friends came together and they bought a new camera for him. Within 24 hours, he had a new camera. That was pretty amazing. That's not the kind of stuff I'm used to seeing on other social networks. It's that people are forming real connections with each other, right? They really see each other as human beings that they've talked with, that they had hangouts with, that they've connected with on an emotional level. So that's pretty unique. There's plenty. Yeah, sure, question? So I think the question was, can I explain why it's different? I think it's, well, what I call the DNA of a network, right? The real-time nature is part of it, because if you see people responding, you respond to them, and you start to have a conversation. Whereas if you post something and nobody responds to it, it becomes a status message, which is different from a conversation. A status message is, I'm here in the GDD Tel Aviv. A conversation is, hey, I'm in the GDD Tel Aviv, and we're doing this session, somebody replies, and you give an answer, and you have a conversation interaction with someone. The other thing that creates that is, if you enter a message in Google+, you get this nice and big edit box where you can start typing into. So subliminally, it tells you type a longer message. Whereas if you go to Facebook, they have a smaller font and a very small input window. So subliminally, that tells you type a very short message. This is just a status update. There's all these little different things that create an interaction between people. So I can't tell you exactly putting a fine point on this is the exact difference, but it's hundreds of little things that create a completely different interaction on a network. One of the other things that I think is very exciting about it is circles, and I think that's a big part that goes into the culture as well. Who here is familiar with our story on circles, why we're so excited about it? There's a few hands, but it's not the majority, so I'll go through the concept a little bit. When we were thinking about Google+, we were thinking like, well, sharing on the web right now is broken. We don't like the way that sharing works, because what we've noticed is that people share with 200 or 300 friends. And that means that everything you do is a message that's good for a wide audience. They're not your private messages, they're not pictures of your children's birthday party, because you wouldn't show that to 300 people that happen to be your work colleagues and strangers you met at conferences. And if maybe someone in your family has an illness and you find some research on it, you're not going to share that with your work buddies or drinking buddies either, right? You want to share that with just your family. And if you go out partying in the weekend, you probably don't want to show the pictures of you being half drunk in some bar to your parents. At least I don't. I don't know about you guys. So it turns out we have all these different groups in our life that we have different conversations with. And we call those circles, because they're social circles in your life. That's the name of the concept. So when you create a post in Google+, you share it either publicly. If you want to shout something out to the entire world and you want everybody to see it, you use public. If, on the other hand, it's something you think is only relevant to a certain group of people, like you're at a conference, you probably want to share with just your tech friends. If you're having a private party, you just want to share with your real friends and your college buddies, et cetera, et cetera. So it gives you very fine-grained control of saying, these are the groups of people that I have in my life, and then it gives you a way to communicate with just that group of people. So instead of making everything you post a public performance in front of 300 people, you get to just have a conversation with the right people. Because in the end, the stuff that you share with only a few people is the most important stuff, right? That's often where the real emotions and the real events are. So that's the concept of circles. And I think that partially answers your question as well about why is there a different behavior here? Because you can have these kind of conversations. Because most of the time when you post something publicly, it's, I like this new coffee maker, I like this new bicycle, whatever. It's not, hey, I've had a really bad day because this thing happened in my personal life. You have that conversation just with your best friends, not with the rest of the world. So it lends itself to these kind of conversations, and that's pretty magical. And the thing that excites me is that it's really working as well. If we look at the content that's being shared within the network, about 2/3 of every post is private. Just 2 circles. Only 1/3 of all the content is public information. So people are getting it, and they're excited about it. And that kind of gets me to the next slide as well. If you add everything up that we just talked about, you get communities, you get people connecting with each other. In this case, it's a photo of a photo walk that I did. You can actually see me there in the blue t-shirt. It helps if you're a bit tall. Dutch fellas like I often are. And photo walks is a basic concept where people are into photography, they get together, they go an interesting place, and they take pictures together, right? And they learn of each other, and they share tips and secrets. And the interesting thing is that because of all these ways of people communicating with each other, connecting with each other, sharing stories with each other, sharing stuff just within circles, it's becoming a very human place. And we're seeing that in all of the events that are happening around it. I'm using the photography community as one of the examples because, well, I've got a camera right here that happens to be one of the communities I like. But we're seeing the same thing with yoga classes. We're seeing the same thing with people who are forming knitting clubs. We're seeing the same thing with people who are giving cooking courses, and they have their laptop on the table as they're eating the dinner afterwards. There's all these connections and communities forming in the platform, and it's incredibly exciting. And finally, the last thing I wanted to tell you in the product is, if you're using it, you're probably thinking, well, it's not completely done yet. And we agree. We launched this saying this is the Google Plus project, and we called it such because we said, well, this is the first version. Nothing good has ever been created in the vacuum, right? You need to work with people, with your end users. You need to have a conversation to see how does this work for you. What should we change? How should we make it better? What's the most important feature for you guys to be able to expand on this? And you can see that in the first 100 days, we added up to 100 features to it already. So that's almost a feature a day on average. We're adding stuff to it in an incredibly high pace. So when we say we're moving slowly and deliberately, it is slowly and deliberately in Google style, which happens to be pretty fast than the rest of the world, I think. And one of my favorite features that I think we launched like a week and a half ago was Ripples, for instance. Ripples was, hey, we're launching brand pages soon, and that's going to be important because now companies will start using Google Plus as well. And they want to see who their top influencers are, who is resharing their content, who's responding to it. So Ripples is a new menu option that with every post you can now see who is resharing it, who has the biggest impact, so you can start engaging with them. And we've got a whole bunch of other features just as cool as this coming down the pipeline. So with that, I'm kind of done with the general introduction, and I'd like to go to the platform stuff, and I presume that's why everybody's here. But I still felt it was important that you guys kind of understand, like, how do we get started, and where are we coming from, and potentially where are we going? And that was kind of the blog post that I did as well, and as I said, I'm in photography, so most of these pictures I took myself. When I wrote a blog post saying, hey, we're now launching the Google Plus platform, I started with this quote. It's one of my favorite. A journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step. And what I meant to say with that is that what we're releasing right now, they're just the first steps. We're just getting started, right? So if you're looking at the platform of the state today, you're probably thinking, how can I add this other cool functionality to it? And the answer is, well, we're going to get there. We know this is a long journey. But we also want to be very careful not to repeat some of the mistakes in the past. And have people here made social applications before? See, that's a large chunk of the audience here. So I'm sure that most of you remember where Twitter used to say, well, maybe it's really good if you guys build a front end for Twitter because we care just about the back end. And then a few years down the road, they said, and I don't think this was malice, I don't think they did this on purpose. They just didn't have a crystal ball and they didn't see the future. But they went, well, looking at our business today and how people are using it, we're not going to allow that anymore. And companies went bankrupt. People's lives were destroyed over that. They killed an entire ecosystem. So putting stuff out there and saying, well, this is going to be fun, have at it, build anything that you feel like building, and then changing our minds, we don't want to do that. We respect our developers way too much to repeat that mistake. Another mistake that happened is the tragedy of the commons type of mistake. Now, for people who are not into Greek mythology, the tragedy of the commons is where every actor does something that makes sense to them individually. For instance, Farmville is one of my popular examples that I personally use. Farmville, when it just launched, it was one of the first big games on the social web, right? Everybody remembers it probably. And it was awesome because there were millions of people playing it, so they were happy, they were entertained. It was awesome for Facebook because people kept going back to the website to farm their crops. Incredible engagement. And it was really good for Zynga as well because they became a huge social business in no time flat. So if you look at all those individual actors, you would think it was the best thing since sliced bread. But on the other hand, it's also become an example of the worst thing to do on a web, right? It's why if we're now doing stuff in Google+, people say, well, I hope I'm not going to get spammed by games. I hope this kind of non-human engagement isn't going to happen on your platform. So if you add all those things up together, it didn't necessarily lead to the healthiest situation. So we realized that developers and applications are the most important thing for Google+. But we want to get there in a way where we don't have to say, whoops, stuff happened where we're not happy with it and it's hurting the entire ecosystem. And now we're going to have to step in and change everything radically again. So that's why we're moving one step at a time. We're taking the slow, deliberate approach to this. So our first step with what I just told you in mind is the public data APIs. We said, well, the safe choice to make is that public data, it's already out there. You could get off a web page. There's no risk involved. So to get you guys engaged with how the API works, the technical implementations, the libraries, documentations, and everything else, this is a great start. This is a great first step to take that we all agree on. That's a good first step. The public data APIs allow you, as the name implies, they're APIs to get to your public information. The public information is everything on your profile that you marked as public. So there's always a name and a thumbnail picture and some other basic information. But you can choose if you make your schools or your About Me section or work employment and that kind of stuff, if you make that public or not. But everything that's public on your profile is going to be accessible through the People API. Every activity that you post that's public is going to be accessible through the API as well. And comments, +1s, and everything else that's public is accessible through this API. So you can already build quite a few useful use cases with that. For instance, one of the things we did a couple of weeks ago was that in America was Halloween. Now, Halloween is probably not a big thing here. I know it wasn't back in the Netherlands either. In America, it's huge. It's one of the biggest holidays out there. And people love to dress up. That's what they do. They have a big party, they have a funny costume, and everybody gets drunk and has a good time. It's a thing, right? So we launched a couple of new features. One of the features was Creative Kit. And Creative Kit was something where you could edit a picture, you can add effects to it, you could do cool image manipulations with it. And we figured what better way to celebrate it than with a Halloween contest. So we asked people, take your profile picture and make it as scary as possible. And we're going to have a contest, and we're put this hashtag in there, the G+Halloween, and we will select the scariest, coolest picture, and we'll give you some t-shirts and some other cool swag. So millions of people played this game. It was awesome. So by the time it was time that we thought, well, how are we going to select a winner? Oh, okay, well, we have to write a little script for that. So writing a little script is pretty easy when you're using the public data APIs because search happens to be one of the functions in there. So you can write an application that just searches for that tag, see if there's an image attached to it, and display it. I'm only showing a couple of the pictures here, but there were hundreds of thousands of them submitted. So the way that you build this is that the way we're doing Google APIs right now is that you first have to register your application in the API console. And the API console gives you access to all of our new Google APIs. And the thing that's pretty cool is that we used to have all these different APIs. I bet a whole bunch of you in the room have used GData APIs, right? Or XML-based APIs, and JSON-based APIs, and OAuth1 and OAuth2, and it was a bit of a mess. And we had all these conflicting terms of services as well that sometimes even meant that you legally couldn't combine certain APIs together. And that made sense in the time because we started with one API, and before we knew it, we had 100 APIs. So at some point, we had to say, well, we need to improve this. We need to make it very easy for you as a developer to say, well, Google's a toolbox. I'm just going to open it and take the APIs that I want, and it should just work. Well, and so we built this new API infrastructure. It's JSON-based, OAuth2-based. There's one central place to register your application, and that's the API console. So you go to the API console, you register as a user, you create a project, and as soon as you created a project, you can go to the Services tab. In the Services tab, you see all the APIs that are currently supported in this new API interface. And I think there's about 80 or 90 of them already. So you've got the Translate, the Cloud, the Storage, the Google Plus, of course, Latitude, Moderator, all these other functions are accessible for there. So if you scroll down a little bit, you will see that there's a Google Plus API, and for later in the day, there's also a Google Plus Hangouts API. Just click on Enable, you get a terms of service that you say, okay, I agree with it. It's a new universal terms of service, so it's pretty similar to all of the other APIs. And once you've done that, you can already start calling the API. The next step that you need is that you need to configure the keys that this registration process gives you and put it into your application, right? The other thing to note, though, is that we have a quota. Kind of thinking in, we want to take a careful first step is, we want to make sure that the applications people are building. Oh, that's the same lens as me. Hold on. Gotcha. I told you I was in photography. So we want to be sure that the applications that people are building, that they're useful, that they're not doing bad things with people's data. We don't think that's going to happen, but to make sure that we have some control over it, we start people off with a courtesy quota of 1,000 requests a day. If you click on the Request More link, you get a little form that you fill in. We ask you, where's your privacy policy? Because we don't tell you what to do with your privacy policy. We just want you to be very clear with your end users and tell them what you're going to do with the data. So it could be anything from, we're going to sell it to the Chinese government, to we won't even store it. We're okay with that, as long as it's legal. We just want you to be clear to your end users, right? So we will take that form, we'll evaluate your request, and if it looks like you're just a decent application, we'll approve it within a couple of days. So getting more quota is not a big issue. The one hint I would like to give you is that smaller quota requests are easier than bigger quota requests. We sometimes get some people who say, I'm just going to ask for 100 billion because then I never have to ask again. Well, if you think about the infrastructure cost for 100 billion API calls a day, that's pretty expensive. So you better have a very good reason for asking for big numbers. So start with a reasonable number. If you request 10,000 or 100,000, it's going to be easier to say yes than 100 million. Just something to keep in mind. It will make our lives easier as well. So as soon as you've done all of those steps, which only takes about 5 minutes, so it's not such a big deal, you get a client ID and you get OAuth secrets. Those are your magic keys to be able to start calling the API, right? So in this case, because we're calling public APIs, you really only need the simple API access. You don't have to do OAuth at all. Sorry. So in some cases, you do want to do OAuth. For instance, there's an endpoint for getting the information on the currently authenticated user. Obviously, you need to be authenticated for that. And as we release APIs for non-authenticated information, like my private post or my circles and my personal friends, etc., OAuth will become more relevant, but right now, the simple API key is all you need to be able to start calling stuff. So once you've done that, you probably think, well, how are we going to build this application? So what we wanted to do is we're going to search for the G+ Halloween tag. So you go to our documentation site, which is developers.google.com/plus, the character plus. And you'll see that we have this whole new look and feel on the documentation site. I like it a lot better than the old one. As much time as I spent there, it wasn't the prettiest or easiest to use site. And for every API call, we've got a clear description. How does it work? What stuff goes into it? What are the parameters that you can use to call it? In this case, for instance, with search, you can order it by either how new stuff is or how it's ranked. So stuff with a lot of comments and +1s will probably be a better post than something that has no engagement on it at all. In my case, I used the new sort because I wanted to see all of the pictures to be able to judge it right. And finally, and this is consistent in all of our API, you'll see that there's a page token. It turns out it's really difficult when you have dozens of data centers to do pagination by number, because page 1 to 5 isn't the same in every data center. So what we do is that we have page tokens. They're stored and synced between all the different places. So if you get 10 results and you say, give me the next 10 results, and you give it a page token, we can always figure out what the next consistent set of 10 results is. So we don't do pagination with an index. It always happens with a page token. Good to keep in mind. And finally, we also have a definition of everything that comes out of it. So this is pretty new, and this is all generated by this new API implementation that we've done. So that's pretty exciting, because that means that all of those new APIs are going to have this kind of new consistent documentation, right? And finally, my favorite feature, I think, is the API Explorer. I don't know about you guys, but when I look at a new API, I always want to try it out. Does this give me the information that I need? Does it kind of do what I expected it will do? And that feeds into my program design, how I'm going to build my objects and data models and all that kind of stuff, right? So the API Explorer is embedded in this documentation page, and you can just execute the function you're currently looking at. So in this case, we're looking at search. And the query that I'm filling in is G plus Halloween. And as soon as you hit execute, it actually gives you the whole data set back of what the request you've just sent. It also shows you the GET request and the headers and everything else involved. So it gives you all the information to already see how does this API work and what am I going to get out of it. So next up is one of the other exciting things, and that's that we now have libraries. We used to build libraries for every API, but now that we have this new API interface, we have one library that works with all of these new API endpoints. So you can download a library in your favorite language, if your favorite language is one of the 6 we support. So there's .NET and Python and Java and PHP and Ruby and JavaScript. It's just below the page here. And as soon as you download that library, you can also get a starter project, and it's as simple as unpacking it, putting in your API key, and you can start making calls. So getting up and running with one of our new APIs is a 10-second exercise, which is different from back in the day. I remember I was here doing an open social talk, and about 50% of the session was spent on this is how you use OAuth. And no, OAuth signatures don't use the standard RFC encoding. It was a big hassle, and even after spending half an hour on telling people how to use OAuth, it was still the #1 question in our mailing list. So the wonderful thing about using these libraries is you don't even have to know how our API works. You just talk to it in your native language, and it just works. So in this case, for instance, I like to use PHP a lot when I write a small, big script. A small, quick script, yeah, that's the one. So what you would do in PHP, and this kind of translate into every language, but then, of course, in their own ways of including stuff. Ruby is different from the imports in Java, etc. But the concept translates over to all of these libraries. You import the required library, the API client, and in this case, I want to talk to the Google Plus service. You create a client, you set the developer key, that's that API key you got in the API console, and you create the service. Bang, that's already it. You can start talking to the API now. So the next step is we want to implement a search function. So the basic function call you see in the bottom there is plus activity search. That's the function we're looking at the documentation. And I'm going to give it a couple parameters. The parameters is so how many results do I want to have per page. I want to order it by recent. Remember, I wanted to have all the pictures. And the query I'm looking for is G plus Halloween. It's that simple. And of course, if there's a pagination token, I add that to the parameters as well. That's how I can page for all of the result sets. That's the search function. That's all it takes. There's no coding, there's no HTTP request, there's no OAuth, nothing of that sort. The next step is, of course, I want to show the pictures. You get the result set, and you just iterate through it. It's an array. And again, translate this to your native language, but they're usually an array or an object, and you can iterate through it. And the thing that's in there is that you have this top-level object with, hey, this is a search result. In there, there's items. Those items are activities. Has anybody here ever used activity streams as a specification? Nobody at all except for the Googler in the house. Ouch. So activity streams is a new specification that says we need to have a common way of describing social activities that happen on the web. Because Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn and Hives and everything else, they have their own little definition. So it makes it very difficult to write some software that works with all of them. And the way that activity streams define it is that there's an object. An object is the thing that happened. In the object, there's an actor, the person who did it. There's a verb, the thing that he was doing. And there was the thing that he was doing itself. So in most cases in Google+, it's going to be a post with a note attached to it. And in some cases, it could be an object with an attachment, and an attachment can be a photo. That's what we're looking at this case. So there's going to be an actor, there's going to be a verb, he posted something, and there's going to be attachment with a type of photo. That's exactly what we're looking for. If you execute this search parameter, you look at the JSON, you'll see all the fields there. But it feels pretty natural if you start coding against it. So that's the loop we built here, that we look at the resulting objects, we go through it, and we do a bit of basic HTML output. I omitted most of the styles here because that's not the interesting thing on the slide. But basically, the point is that in 12 lines of code, you can already write a basic search like this. Finally, this is the main loop. It calls search photos every time we get a page token, means we're not at the end of the result set. We do the search, we display it, and that's it. Then you've got the whole program. And in 20 lines of code, you build a basic program like this. So if you want to do something as simple as, I've got something where there's a competition, or you can post pictures with a hashtag, or if people mention my brand name or anything else, very easy to do with the Search API. What you can also very easily do is, because we have activity list functions, is saying something like, I want to create a blog based on my post, or I want to take the post from my official account and show them on my homepage. Quite easy to do, it's the activities list function. The other thing you can do is, because we include things like the reshares and the +1s and everything else in the activities, is if you want to do social scoring. And I took this screenshot just before they launched the Google+ support. I don't know if you guys are familiar with cloud, but this is embarrassingly low. 50 is a respectable score. 15 is, I didn't really exist for the last year in the social web, apparently. Fortunately, 2 weeks ago, they did launch Google+ support, and I'm back up there again. So very happy they added support to it. And of course, data visualizations. I guess the contrast here isn't as good as I hoped. This is a WebGL implementation of a globe, and they show like sparks of where activity is happening on the Earth. Very easy to build with our APIs. And if you see the real thing, it looks really good. So in summary, I hope that you kind of get our thinking behind the way that we're building our platform. We're moving deliberately. We want to make sure that we don't have to change reminder, that we don't do anything that would hurt the beautiful ecosystem that we're building. We are taking steps forward, so we've released a couple APIs. We're releasing new API functionality in that in the next couple days or weeks. So if the favorite stuff that you're looking for isn't in there yet, stay tuned. But I think that with the basic functionality that we have, you could already start building some pretty interesting applications. So with that out of the way, I'd like to go to Q&A. I think we have about 10 minutes left if Ade doesn't mind starting a bit late. So who's got a question? The purple shirt? So the page token is a pagination token. So whenever you call an API, you get like 10 or 20 results in it. If you want to have the next 20 results, the way you do that is by calling the same API call, exactly the same API call again, but then with the page token equals that little text string. And then we know to give you the next 20, and the next 20, and the next 20, and the next 20. Because all of them might be millions of them, which has some practical limitations. Like in some cases, if there's 20 activities, you can get 20 activities, right? If there's 100, that will probably work. But at some point, our API is going to say, well, we can't return 100,000 activities. That would just be too expensive on our server. So right now, not every API returns the full number in there. So the way that you know that you have all of them is just keep calling it until there's no page token in there anymore. So that's how you get all of them, or you just stop whenever you feel you've had enough. True. Yeah, we don't have that in there, right? Yeah, total results is an activities list, but not in search. So some of them have that information. Cool. In the back there, black t-shirt. Mm-hmm. It only aggregates results from From Twitter. Oh, then we need to have a chat with them. We use it a lot. I know that in our previous conferences, we had this big wall with all the public posts on it, and we added Google Plus support to that, and that was a big hit. So I don't know, maybe we just need to talk to the Android guys. They're in the next room. I'll go and find them afterwards. Yeah, up here? So it's a policy question. How do we feel about combining the results with other APIs? That is tricky. So we do have some policy about commercial use for advertising of private information. So that kind of depends on what type of API you're thinking about. Oh, that would not be an issue at all. We believe that people own their own information and you should be able to use it. So as long as it's public or you've got a user's permission to use something, use it in whichever way you see fit, except as long as it doesn't violate our policies. And we have a few policies around, the usual criminal acts and some commercial usage. But generally speaking, that's perfectly okay. Anyone up here? Yeah, in the blue shirt? So the question is it possible to build an application that allows the user to post something or interact? Two different answers. The posting is already possible through the +1 button. So if something has a web page, a user can +1 it and he can choose to share it to the stream. We don't allow people to post through the APIs yet. And the reason for that is, like we said, we don't want to put something out there where we have to change our mind again. One of the things we learned with like Google Buzz, Google Friend Connect, and other social products we made is that people like human interaction. Like there's something magical happens when it's two people talking to each other. But when you're talking to a machine, it feels dead. It's not a real interaction. So we want to find a way that people post real human expressions without all the automated posts getting to the system that the human had no part in. Because when they had no part in it, they're probably not going to react to the comments or the +1s and that kind of stuff. Or it's going to feel like dead content. So right now the +1 button is a solution. We've got other cool solutions coming out. But it's something we're spending a lot of time thinking about, of how to solve this in the correct way. And just to paint a bit of perspective, like I bet a bunch of you use Facebook. In the beginning, it was true that if you posted something on Facebook, it would always show up in the stream. Nowadays, if you post something to the stream, chances are nobody will ever see it. So these are the type of changes that the entire social web is going through, trying to figure out how to solve this issue. We're not sure yet, but we're thinking hard about it. If you have suggestions as an application builder, let us know. Like I said earlier, we're never going to build something good in a vacuum. So if you could tell me I could build a successful business that would allow me to do X, that would be incredibly useful information for us. Yeah.
In the summer, officially, so roadmap for the things you release, because over the past 100 days, you released 100 features.
Mm-hmm.
How do we as developers know what features you're going to release?
So luckily, we launched the Google Plus pages last week, so we now have a Google Plus developer page. So that's the page to follow to get all the release information. And otherwise, you can add me to a circle. I always repost that stuff too. I think we have time for one more question, and then my time is up.
Is there any kind of a roadmap that at least shows future direction?
So the question was, do we have a roadmap? No, unfortunately, we don't. The reason for that being is, well, first of all, we're moving so fast that committing to something 6 months down the road, we don't know yet. We're engaging with developers on how to build the API. We're engaging with end users and the reports we get from Send feedback on how to build the social platform itself. So a lot of it is based on your input, and it makes it harder to have a big roadmap. Vic, on the other hand, at the Web 2.0 conference said that a lot of our very big new developer features are going to launch at Google I/O. So that's the only roadmap I can give you, Google I/O. We're going to see a lot of cool stuff.
Compared to some of your rivals,
Mm-hmm.
you want to keep those APIs pretty much steady, or are they expected to change on the fly overnight?
So the question was, are we going to keep our API steady? Well, that's one of the core principles I told you at the introduction of the platform. we don't want to have to change our mind. So everything we release, we're pretty darn certain about. I think we all agree that Google has a big reputation of being very fast and very stable. And we definitely want to build APIs that are going to be predictable as well. And we're not going to change them every day or every week. So that would be good. Well, thank you all so much for your time.